In all my years of teaching web design, some of the most frequently asked questions that new designers ask centers around the building of and the functionality of online forms. In this chapter, we will examine using Dreamweaver to help us build and style clean and accessible forms. Unfortunately, making the forms functional is a bit outside the scope of this course. For more information on the processing of form data, see David Gassner's Dreamweaver Dynamic Development title in the lynda.com online training library. However, before we begin building our form, it's important that conceptually you understand how forms work and how websites generally process form data. One of the most popular misconceptions about forms is that the form itself does any work at all. For the most part, forms merely collect the data from your user and send it to another page or script to be processed. This page is typically referred to, logically enough, as the processing page. This page often shows a message that gives users feedback regarding the success or the failure of the form submittal. Therefore, when you log into a website and see a page that says, "Thanks for logging in," chances are that's the page that did all the work. Forms are created by using a form tag. The form tag contains the name of the form, a method, and an action. The action tells the form what to do with the collected data or where to send it. This is typically a link to the processing page or script. The method describes how the form should send the data. For the method, there are two options, post and get. Get appends the form data to the query string, while post submits the data in the head of the request document. That basically means that form data submitted with get is visible in the page address after submittal, while data submitted with post is hidden to the end user. The submittal method that you use will depend upon how the processing script is expecting to receive the data, and based on limitations of the submittal types themselves. Data submitted with get is less secure and risks being truncated due to query string length limitations. Therefore, get is typically used for non-critical data and short form data, such as a search form. Post is typically used for more secure transactions and for forms where longer data like user comments are submitted. The form data is then sent to the processing page, where server-side software, such as ColdFusion, PHP, .NET, or JSP, receive the data and process it, often using SQL to submit and retrieve data from a database based on the form request itself. This information is then written to the database, returned to the user, or any of the other myriad uses for form data. While this description is a somewhat simplified explanation of how forms work online, for most forms, this is the basic framework. Now that we have a greater understanding of how forms work, we can turn our attention to building our own form. Before we start creating our own form, we'll take a look at the finished file to discuss the structure and functionality of our final form. Just as with any design, the success and failure of our form will rely largely on our attention to the small details. Designing for the web means focusing on interface design and usability, and nowhere is this more evident than with forms. Poorly designed form creates a negative user experience and may prevent users from further using or exploring your site. A good form design creates a seamless user experience and provides enough feedback to keep the user moving forward, which is exactly what we want them to do. As with the other elements in your site, accessibility is important, and designing your forms with accessibility in mind is a very good practice. So here in our browser, I have our finished form open, and I'm going to scroll down, and we're just going to take a second to examine our form and what we're going to be building. Now, this is a form that's going to allow people who are using the Explore California website to join their community, the Explorers. And so there's certain information that we need from these users before they can join the user community. You'll notice that the form is actually split up into three sections. We have personal information, login information, and then a tour profile that's going to help us sort of match people together and make sure that we are catering to their specific interests. Now, because of the fact that we have those three distinct areas, notice that visually we've separated them and made it very easy for someone to progress from one area of the form to another. Our form has been designed with accessibility in mind as well, allowing users to tab through the form in the order they encounter the form elements, which is a very, very nice practice. We've also added a little bit of client-side validation as well. Notice, for example, that if I come down into the password section and start entering a password, I get some immediate feedback from the form that says that needs to be at least 6 characters. So we have some client-side form validation here that Dreamweaver makes surprisingly easy to incorporate into your forms. Also notice that we have some fairly non-standard form layout going on here. We've got 3 columns worth of checkboxes for which tours they are wanting to follow. We have consistent widths for our labels and our text input fields. So we're going to concentrate on styling our form in a way that gives us a nice, visually appealing layout. Okay, so now that we know the structure and theory behind our form design, we're going to begin building it. When planning your form design, you'll need to consider how the form should be structured to collect the data, what obstacles users might encounter along the way, and what visual styling and interactivity you can use to guide them and instruct them along each step of the form. You'll also need to know which form elements are used to collect certain types of data so that you'll use the right ones given the situation. Giving somebody a radio button group, which only allows one choice, for a question that should allow for multiple choices is a bad idea. By considering carefully all of the goals and the usability issues of your form before you begin working on it, you're going to create a functional, effortless form that enhances the usability of your site. Creating an accessible form takes a minimal amount of work, and the increased access that gives your users to your site makes it well worth the extra time. Just as with images and tables, Dreamweaver has accessibility features built into its form creation tools. Once you set the accessibility preferences for form elements in Dreamweaver, you are prompted from then on to set accessibility settings for form elements as you build the form. This workflow makes the process of building accessible forms quick and painless. Let's take a moment to set our form accessibility preferences and review what you can do to make forms more accessible. So I'm just going to go right up to my preferences. On the PC, that is Edit Preferences. On the Mac, of course, it would be Dreamweaver Preferences. And once again, I'm going to go to my Accessibility category. I'm just going to verify that Form Objects is checked. Again, that is the default, so unless someone has gone in there and manually changed that, that should be the case. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK and go right back onto my page. Now, what does that mean to have accessibility preferences turned on for your form? Well, what that means is that as you begin adding form elements to your page, Dreamweaver is going to begin prompting you for certain accessibility attributes. The best way to see that, of course, is to do it for yourself. So let's just jump in and do this. I have the form practice file open in the 1203 directory, and it's a totally blank page. So just go ahead and place your cursor anywhere on the page. And what you want to do is go up to your insert panel and focus on your forms objects. That's what we're going to be using for the overwhelming bulk of this particular chapter. So you can just sort of set that as you're working in this chapter and forget it. We're going to be using forms a good bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and place a form tag on the page. Anytime that you're building a form, that should be step number 1, insert a form tag. You'll find the form tag insert icon right up here in our insert panel. It's the very first icon in the forms group. So it looks like a little box with a red border, and I'm just going to click to insert that on my page. Now, Dreamweaver is going to display forms for you visually with this red dashed outline. That's very helpful because it allows you to make sure that all of your form elements and everything that belongs to your form is inside of the form tag. Otherwise, the form tag is invisible and you really wouldn't see it. So this allows you to sort of visualize where your form is on the page and to make sure all of your form elements are in the right place. Now, one of the first things that we always do with a form is name it. So I'm just going to go right down here to my form ID and name this FRM Practice. It's a personal choice. I always put FRM on the beginning of any forms because what we've just done is we've assigned an ID to our form tag. And with FRM, if I ever see that particular ID in my styles or in any JavaScript somewhere, I know that it's referencing a form. So I always put FRM on the front end of it, but again, personal choice. Now the action would be the link to whatever processing page. We don't have a processing page, so we'll have to discuss that when we create our own form. Same thing for method. We just wanted to give our form a name. Okay, now making sure that your cursor is inside of your form, what we're going to do now is start inserting a form element on the page and see what Dreamweaver does to ensure that we have accessible form elements. So the first form element we're going to place on the page is probably the most common, and that is the text field. So I'm just going to go right beside the form tag, find text field, and click to insert that. So here we have a fairly large dialog box that comes up, and this is our input tag accessibility attributes. So the reason we're seeing this is because we turned on our accessibility attributes for forms. The first thing that Dreamweaver wants to know is, okay, what ID do you want to give this? We're just going to go ahead and title it name. Now, what this is going to be is this is going to be the ID attribute for the input tag. A text field is a special type of an input tag, and by giving this an ID, we're doing a couple of things. Number one, we're identifying it as a unique form element, but number two, the ID that we give this is often the same exact name of this column within whatever database this form might be submitted to. That'll assist anybody that's writing server-side code to match form values to the database. It's not required, but it's a really good idea that if you're working with the individual that's going to be creating the processing script for your form, just ask them what you want the ID to be for each of the input fields. Now, label is the text that's going to show up beside the form. So a lot of times people will type in the text first, like first name, last name, address, and then add the form element. Through the use of this dialog box, we don't have to do that. Not only do we not have to do that, but we're getting the added accessibility benefit of placing a label on the page. So our label for this one is going to be user name and then a colon. Now we have some options here about how this label is going to be related to the form element. We can either attach the label tag using a for attribute, wrap with the label tag, or just don't put any label tag on at all. Well, we're going to use the for attribute, not only for this example, but for the rest of our form as well. And as soon as we place this on the page, I'm going to go into code and talk about why we're going to be doing it this way. Notice we can also position the label either before the form item or after it. That's usually going to change based on what type of form element you have. For text fields, most people are used to seeing them before the form item, so we're going to keep it that way. For access key, we're going to leave that one blank, but that is a nice accessibility attribute. If somebody is using a screen reader or other type of assistive technology, access keys can be sort of a nice shortcut as a way of getting into that particular form element. Tab index is something that at a minimum you should do. That's going to tell whatever browser or user agent is processing your form which order the form elements should go in if somebody tabs through the form. That's extremely helpful, and yes, forms will do that sort of on their own, but then it's up to the user agent or the browser agent to determine the order, and they don't always get it exactly right. So I'm just going to put in a tab index of 10 and click OK. So there's our form element. As I mentioned before, I want to switch over to code view really quickly and talk about what's going on here. Well, this is the input tag. This is our text field. Notice that the type attribute is set to text. That's what makes it a text field. Notice that we have both a name and an ID attribute that are the same as the ID attribute we gave the form element when we placed it on the page. And there's our tab index. Now, here's the label. Now, basically, the label tag is used to relate text to a form element. That lets any type of device out there know that this text applies to that form element, and it can be incredibly instructive if somebody is not accessing your page visually. Now, the reason that we use the for attribute, and the reason that I like this so much, notice that it says label for equals name. So it's looking for this ID right here, name, and it's relating those two to each other. That allows you to have the label in one place and the form element in another. That can be extremely handy when you're laying your forms out, especially if you want your labels and your input text fields to say be beside each other or stacked on top of each other. It just separates them. The other option is to just go ahead and wrap that. Let me show you what that would look like. If you removed the for attribute and took the label tag and just surrounded the input with it, now, since that's all one unit, it's a little bit easier for user agents to say, okay, those two are related. But from a styling standpoint, it's a lot harder for us. So that is why I personally really like to use the for attribute for the label tag. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of a clearer picture as to what our responsibilities are when creating forms, and what we can do to make them a little bit more accessible. Other accessibility options, such as the field set and legend tags when we're dealing with forms, will be discussed as we create our forms. With that information in mind, we're now ready to create our Explorer California registration form. To create a form, you must first have a form tag. All form elements like checkboxes, text fields, and menus must be inside the form tag to be considered part of the form. Although Dreamweaver will wrap a form tag around any form element you place on the page that isn't already inside a form. And what I mean to say is that if you just decide, hey, I want to place a text field on the page, Dreamweaver is going to automatically wrap it in a form. However, that's not a good practice. It's better to consciously choose to place a form tag on the page so that you are in total control of how your form is constructed. In Dreamweaver, the Insert panel is where we'll access all of our form elements. So if you're not already, make sure you have your Insert panel open and make sure you have your Forms tab selected. And almost all of our form elements are in that one single location. So typically when you're building a form in Dreamweaver, you really won't need any additional resources. That pretty much has everything that you're going to need. So we're going to start out building our form by placing a form tag on the page and then setting some of the basic form properties for this. So I have the join.html file open. So I'm going to scroll down the page a little bit. And I noticed that right after our last paragraph where we're talking about the privacy policy, I can hit return to create a new paragraph. Now, that new paragraph, I didn't really need to do that, but hey, it gives us a nice blank line down there. All right, so I'm going to go up to my insert panel and making sure I'm on the forms objects, and I'm going to go ahead and insert a form. There we go. So our paragraph gets replaced with our form element, which is fine. And as long as you're focused on the form, your properties inspector is going to display those form properties. It's not uncommon to click around or not mean to do something and then you lose them, like this, for example. Let's say I click into this paragraph and you're like, oh no, how do I get my form properties back? Well, very simple. Just click inside your form, and using your tag selector, you can select the form tag to focus on it. Now, if you click inside an empty form tag, that's going to happen automatically. But if you've got some content already in there, be sure to use the tag selector to actually select the form tag so that you can see these properties. Okay, the first thing we're going to do here is give our form an ID, and I'm going to name this form FRM capital J join, all one word, FRM join. You know, once again, I like placing that FRM as a prefix on any of my form IDs. That helps me know when I scan through the IDs in my CSS or look at any references that I've made to the form elsewhere in code that it is referring to a form. Now, the action we're going to do is point it to a page called join_process.php. Now, let me be very, very clear about this. That page does not exist. Now, later on in the Dreamweaver CS5 Dynamic Development course, David Gassner is going to walk you through how to build those types of processing pages. Fact of the matter is, that's a little outside of the scope of this course, and we're just placing it there to have a placeholder, not to actually do anything with the data. Same thing with our method. We are free to use either get or post, but for a form like the one that we're going to build, more than likely you'd be using post. We have text areas, we have a lot of form data, we've got passwords that we need to be secure, so we're probably not going to append them to any type of a query string, and we'll just use post as the method. All right, cool. So now we have our form tag, and we've really laid down the foundation that we need for building out the rest of our form. Now, you can go back at any time and select that form tag and modify those properties. So that's especially true if you've got any changes or if the processing page has changed, that sort of thing. You're also free to begin building forms without really knowing any of those things. So if you're going to build a form from scratch and you're going to hire a developer later on to build the processing page, you can leave all of that blank and then ask the developer what those values should be. Now, I feel it's a best practice to go ahead and fill them out as you start building the form, especially if you know what the settings are going to be. That way you can avoid any errors caused by forgetting to go back and setting them later. And yeah, I'm afraid that does happen. Organization is just as important in a form as it is to the rest of your site, maybe even more so. Especially in longer forms, you may have several areas of content that would be better organized if there were some way to divide them into separate sections. The field set and legend tags allow us to do just that. The field set tag is used to create the separate regions in your form, while the legend tag is used to identify them. Both assist with accessibility and the organization of your form elements. For our form, we'll have 3 field set regions: the personal info, login info, and tour profile regions. Before we begin placing individual form elements on the page, we'll create our field sets first. So here I have the join.html file open. Picking up where we left off, we have our empty form tag on the page. So I'm just going to place my cursor inside that form tag. You want to see it blinking inside that red dotted box. We're going to go up to our insert panel, and we're going to inset a field set. Now, field sets can be found right here towards the 2/3 on the right-hand side. It looks like a little box with another little box in the upper left-hand corner, which is an incredibly appropriate icon for field sets, as you're about to see. So I'm going to go ahead and click to insert my first field set, and the only option I get when I insert a field set is, well, what do you want inside this legend? So here, I'm going to type in personal information, and you can type anything you want into those. They can be as long as you want. They just need to describe that area itself, and again, most people keep these short, maybe 1 or 2 words. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and there is our first field set. Now, when Dreamweaver sort of renders these as a default with nothing inside of them, it can be really confusing as to where you are and where you've inserted these. So in order to make sure that we don't put one field set inside of another one, that would be bad, we need to do a little precise cursor movement using Dreamweaver. Here's what I'd like you to do. Go down to your tag selector, find the field set tag. It should be just to the left of the legend tag, which should be highlighted. You want to click the field set tag so that you're focused on the field set, and now hit on your keyboard your right arrow key. Now, what does that do for us? It moves us outside of the field set tag to the right. I know it doesn't look like it inside the design view. It looks like we're inside the field set and ready to type, but in reality, we're outside of it. You can see in the tag selector, for example, that it has us just listed as being inside of the form. That is really important that you do that way, because clicking inside of the form right now will probably result in you going back into the field set. So you just sort of do that, don't touch anything else, and insert your next field set. So we're going to go right up here, insert our next field set, and this time the legend is going to be login information. You can see that we have one field set now on top of the other one, and we've got a little bit of separation there. And we want to do exactly the same thing that we did last time for our third field set. I'm going to click on the field set tag, hit my right arrow key so that I'm sure that I'm outside of the login information field set, and add our last one. So one more. And here we're going to go ahead and give that the legend tour profile. There we go. Now, it's never a bad idea to check into code view and make sure that these guys are where they're supposed to be. So I'm going to highlight them just to make them easier to find in the code, and click on split view. And right there we can see we've got exactly what we want. Each field set comes right after the other. If you see them inside of each other, don't panic. You can cut and paste them so that they're stacked on top of each other like this, or you could just delete them and start over again. Just remember to use the tag selector to help you with that. Honestly, there are some things that are just easier to do in code, but at least we can still do that in design view if we need to. All right, I'm going to save this file. And there's really not much to look at yet, but I'm going to go ahead and preview this in my browser anyway, because I want to show you the default styling for field sets and legends. The default styling for a field set is that part of the form will be surrounded by sort of a gray border. The legend itself shows up in the top left-hand corner of the field set and just kind of hovers there in the middle of it. Now, if that is something that you're comfortable with, then that's fine. There are all sorts of styling that you can do with this, but I'm going to go on a limb here and tell you that's the hardest tag in all of CSS to style. We're going to be styling it on our own in just a little bit, but before we start styling all those elements, we need to start building the rest of the form, and we're going to do that next. Probably the most commonly used form element is the text field. The text field allows users to input text for form submittal. There are 3 flavors of the text field: the input text field, password text field, and text area element. The input text field is used for capturing a single line of text and is usually used for names, addresses, and anything else that the user must type themselves that fits on one line. The password text field hides the text that is being typed by the user, but otherwise submits text just like any other input text field. The text area field allows users to submit as many lines of text as they require and is primarily used for commenting or contact forms, where the user needs to submit a larger request. Although you can select the text elements in Dreamweaver and change them from one text field type to the other, Dreamweaver gives us individual icons to insert the text element of choice, so the process is greatly simplified. So here I have the join.html file open, and I'm going to take just a moment to show you where all those different types of text input fields are. If you go up to your insert panel, right after the form element is our first text field. Then we have what's known as a hidden text field and the text area. The hidden field, let me talk about that for just a moment. If you need to force a value for when the form is submitted, let's say you had some type of a session variable, for example, that you wanted to be established as the form was being submitted to let your application know that, hey, this person is now logged on, you would do that through a hidden field. That way, that data would get submitted, but the user doesn't have to actually explicitly choose it. Now, you'll notice we don't have an icon for the password text field, and that's because it's just so easy to toggle the property of your text field using the Properties Inspector once you've placed it on the page. Okay, well, now that we've talked about text fields for a little bit, let's go ahead and place a couple on our form. I'm going to go ahead and place my cursor inside the field set for personal information. If you hit return, you'll create a paragraph, and the way that we're going to structure our form is that each form element is going to be in a separate paragraph. Now, it might seem at first that that's adding unnecessary structure, but the truth of it is those paragraphs are going to allow us to lay out and space our form elements in a way that would be difficult to control otherwise. So now I'm going to go up to my input panel, and I'm going to insert a text field. And from the input accessibility dialog box that comes up, I'm going to add the following information. For ID, I'm going to type in first underscore name. Now again, I'm just sort of saying, well, with the processing script, I probably would want this to say first underscore name, but there's no hard and fast rule what that ID needs to be. It does need to follow the same naming conventions as any other ID. No spaces, don't use punctuation, don't start it with a number, that sort of thing. Now for the label, this is the text that the user is actually going to see out beside it. So here I'm just going to type in first name and then a colon. I'm going to attach this label using the for attribute, just like we discussed in one of our previous movies. I'm going to make sure it's coming before the form item, and I'm going to give it a tab index of 10. I'm going to click OK, and then there's our first text field in our form. Now, you may have been wondering, okay, this is the first element in our form. Why are we giving it a tab index of 10? Why not 1? Well, you could do it that way. I usually use 10s and increments of 10s for each of my form elements. The reason I do that is, let's say I finish a form and I'm already done with it, and the client comes back to me and says, hey, I need to add a couple more form elements. Is that hard to do? Well, for the most part, no, it isn't. I'll just add another space, pop the form element in, I'm good to go. But if my tab index is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and let's say I have 30 elements and I've just added element number 2, now I got to go back and renumber every single one of them. By giving myself increments of 10, I give myself plenty of information for having to add form elements at a later time. Let's go ahead and add a couple more form elements here. I'm going to go to the end of the first name and hit return to create a brand new paragraph. And once again, I'm going to go up and insert another text field. This one, I'm going to give an ID of last underscore name. The label will be last name. Notice that I'm using capital letters there, a colon, space between them. And the tab index for this one is going to be 20. Now, Dreamweaver is going to remember our preferences, so if we've been attaching the label tag for a for attribute, we shouldn't have to choose that again. It's also very smart, and depending upon what type of form element you are inserting on the page, it's either going to have a default of before or after the form item. Usually you won't have to spend a lot of time changing that either. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Let's do one more. So I'm going to go up, hit return to create a brand new paragraph, and then insert another text field on the page. This one's ID is going to be email, and the label for this one will also be email, but this time with a capital E and a colon. I'm going to leave everything else the way it is, but give it a tab index of 30. Okay, now I'm going to save the file, and I want to turn your attention just for a moment to the Properties Inspector. Go ahead and take any of those input text fields that you've just placed on the stage and click it to focus on it. Notice that in the Properties Inspector, we do have some options as to what we can do with this text field. We could rename it if we didn't like the ID we gave it before, or if that's changed. We could give it a specified character width and a maximum number of characters. Now, the character width would affect the visual width of this text field, and it's very tempting to go ahead and do that now so that they're all the same. However, in this case, we're going to be using CSS to do that, so we don't really need to enter that value here. Notice also that this is where we could make the text field a password text field if we wanted to, and we could apply a class to the input text field. That's a good thing because we're going to be doing that a little bit later on. Okay, so our form is well on its way, and it should have given you an idea of how easy it is to place text fields in your form. From this point forward, all that remains is to consider the information we need from our user and which form elements meet the requirement for collecting or presenting that particular type of data. With that in mind, we're going to explore using the list menu item next. Checkboxes are very common form elements that allow your users to make a single selection. Grouped together, they allow the selection of multiple related items. This gives you an alternative to using radio buttons, which only allow for a single selection. Dreamweaver gives us a choice when placing checkboxes in our form. We can either insert them one at a time or within a group. Even though our form has a lot of checkboxes, we'll place them individually so that we have full control over the accessibility and structure of our checkboxes. So here I have the join.html page open, and our checkboxes are actually going to go in another section. So we're going to scroll down a little bit and find our tour profile region. So go ahead and scroll down and find that. After tour profile, hit return to create a paragraph and type in I am interested in the following tours, : So this looks like a label, but it's not. It's going to be a paragraph, and it's going to act as a subheading to the individual checkboxes themselves. Now I'm going to hit return to go down to the next line, and we're going to begin putting in our checkboxes. Now, we have several checkboxes. I think we have about 9 of them to place in, so this is going to take us a little bit of time. However, I do want to discuss the structure of what we're going to do here before we do it. Each checkbox is going to be in its own paragraph. That's going to make this form, for the time being, very tall, taller than it needs to be. Later on, when we discuss styling our forms with CSS, we'll move those checkboxes into a 3-column layout, which is going to be a much nicer visual presentation. But for right now, we're just going to build the initial structure. Okay, so I'm going to place a checkbox on the page, and you can find those right up here in your form objects. They're in this little group right over here on the left-hand side, and you just want to go ahead and click to insert a checkbox. Once again, our accessibility attributes come up, and the first one we're going to place on the page has an ID of backpack. The label for this will be backpack cal. So these are our tour packages. We're going to attach the label using a for attribute. We're going to have it after the form item. So notice how Dreamweaver switched automatically. Before this particular form item, it was always before the form item. Checkboxes and radio buttons are typically after the form item, so Dreamweaver switches that automatically. However, you should be aware of that just in case you wanted the label before it. The tab index here is going to be 110. We're a little further down the form. Go ahead and click OK. And there is our first checkbox. Now, I just did a very common mistake when you're placing checkboxes on the stage. Did you see how I placed a colon in the label? I've got that everywhere else. So you just sort of get in the habit of doing that, and you're like, colon, 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 okay, good. Then you do it here, and you go, oh, yeah, I don't need that. So just go ahead and delete that. And remember, when you're doing radio buttons and checkboxes, that sometimes the rules are a little different. Okay, now we have a lot of these to do, so I'm just going to go ahead and do these in order, placing in all the attributes. Just take your time. Don't worry about doing this quickly. You want to make sure you're doing it right instead of quickly. Speed comes with repetition. So I'm going to hit return to go down to the next line. And once again, I'm going to insert another checkbox. The ID for this one is going to be calm, and the label for this one is going to be California calm, with no colon, might I add. The tab index here is going to be 120, and the other two options I can go ahead and leave the way they are. I'm going to click OK, and I'm just going to keep going. Now remember, after each one of these, I'm going to insert a brand new paragraph by hitting return. I'm going to insert another checkbox on the page. This one's ID is going to be Hot Springs, and the label for this one is going to be California Hot Springs. And the tab index for this one is going to be 130. Scrolling down a little bit more so I can keep an eye on these, I'm going to insert another checkbox. The ID for this one is going to be Cycle, and the label is going to be Cycle California. Tab index for this one will be 140. So we're just going up in increments of 10. Our next checkbox is going to be Desert for the ID. The label is going to be From Desert to Sea. And the tab index for that one will be 150. And I guess From Desert to Sea would be better than Form Desert to Sea, right? Yeah, typos. Gotta love them. All right. So I'm going to insert another checkbox, and the ID for this one is going to be Kids, and that's going to be Kids California. And the tab index for that is going to be 160. The next checkbox ID will be Nature, and the label for that will be Nature Watch. And the tab index for that is going to be 170. As I mentioned before, I'm going through these kind of quickly, but if this is your first time ever placing checkboxes on the stage, you may want to pause the movie and go through each one of these individually and just verify that everything is exactly the way that you need it. I'm going to insert another checkbox on the page. This one's ID is going to be Snowboard. The label will be Snowboard Cali with an I. And the tab index there, 180. One more. Place another checkbox on the page. This one ID is going to be Taste. The label is going to be Taste California. My favorite tour. The tab index is going to be 190. There we go. Now we're done with all of our checkboxes, but just so we can see the properties of that, go ahead and select any one of your checkboxes. It doesn't matter. Notice that each one of them has a checkbox name and then a status as to whether it's checked or unchecked. Now, that points out something. There's supposed to be a checked value here, and each one of these has absolutely no checked value. Now, the checked value, much like with a radio button or a list menu item, that is the value that is sent to the form processing. So that is absolutely crucial. So we're going to go back up to our first checkbox, and we're just going to start adding these to our forms. So although the accessibility attributes is a great dialog box, don't just assume that that is all the information you need for these form elements. So with the first one selected, the checked value for this one is going to be backpack. Now I'm going to use exactly the same thing that we used for the IDs for each of these. So CALM for California CALM, Hot Springs, Cycle. So you can just click on that, take a look at the ID that's over there on the left-hand side of the Properties Inspector, and just go ahead and type that in again. Or if you don't feel like typing, you can obviously copy and paste those. Just remember to go through each one of those and make sure that the ID that's over here in the checkbox name is also what's going to be in the checked value. Now again, that's an arbitrary value. It can be whatever is necessary for the form to process correctly, and whoever is programming your form processing should let you know what you need. In this case, let's say we were sending an email. We could go ahead and create a field within the email that would say tour interest, and then it would just have a list of all of these that happen to be checked. So Taste, Calm, Hot Springs. That would give us an idea as to which tours this person was interested in. Now, while we have our checkboxes for each of our tour packages, they're not looking great. Not to fear, we'll be styling them shortly, but for the moment, I want you to focus on the fact that checkboxes allow a little bit more flexibility than what we're about to do next, which is radio buttons, and you're going to use checkboxes anywhere that more than one answer is allowed. They're also very helpful when the question is a simple yes or no. You can use one checkbox and giving the user the option of either checking it or not. This is a very common way to have people sign up for newsletters or online offers. Now, we'll continue building our form in our next movie by adding a form element that is very similar to checkboxes as we insert radio buttons and radio groups. The list menu item is actually one element that has two possible uses. When placing a list menu item on your page, you can choose to either make it a list or, logically enough, a menu. Now, a menu is going to give your users a pull-down menu that allows only a single choice. These are very good for presenting users with long lists where only one choice is allowed. The list option, on the other hand, allows you to create a list that displays multiple choices. This can be handy for a small list, but it can become a bit cumbersome when used with too many choices. The menu item is by far the more common of the two, and it's what we're going to use in our form for users to identify their home state. And you can see we've got an extra text field in there. I just decided to save you a little bit of time and did that for you. We're just going to create a paragraph directly underneath that, and this is where our pull-down menu is going to go. So let's go up to our Insert panel, and we're going to find this little pull-down menu right there. Select List/Menu. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And just like your text fields, every form element that we place on the page is going to have these accessibility attributes come up. We're going to give this an ID of state. And for label, we're just going to give it state, capitalized, and with a colon there. And the tab index for this one is going to be 50. So again, we're going to attach the label using the for attribute. We're going to place it before the form item, and we're going to go ahead and click OK. So you can see we have a little pull-down menu here, but unlike some of the other form elements, this one is going to require a little bit of work on our part. We're going to have to manually input all of the options for the user. Now, if you're doing dynamic development and you have a database or some type of scripting software that can help you with this, Dreamweaver can hook into those. You can populate these lists or menus through that usage. Since we're doing a static form, we've got to do it ourselves. So roll up your sleeves, get it to your mouse, and off we go. Take a look at the Properties Inspector. We get to choose between menu and list. We're going to choose menu. And the ID again is state. Now, here's where we have to do a little bit of our work. List values, we're going to go ahead and bring that up. And this dialog box is similar to dialog boxes that you're going to see on numerous elements, especially like radio buttons, for example. Now, let's talk about what this means. You have a label on the left-hand side. You have a value on the right-hand side. The label is what the user will actually see in the pull-down menu. So that's what you want to be visual. You're going to make that a little bit more descriptive. But the value is what actually gets submitted with the form. Now, again, if you're working with something as complex as form where you have states, more than likely the developer that's going to be writing the processing scripts is either going to self-populate this form or at least tell you what values you should be using. In this case, we're just going to use some placeholder values. But our first state, at least alphabetically, is Alabama, and the value for that is going to be capital AL. So we're just going to use the abbreviation for them. And go ahead and click OK. So what I want to do now is show you the value of going into code view and knowing how the structure of these form elements work. So I'm going to go ahead and select this form element, and I'm going to switch to split view. And I can see right here that instead of an input tag, I have a select tag. Notice that tab index, ID, name, those attributes are all on there as well. Now, inside the select tag is an option tag. So we have an opening and a closing select tag, and then every single option for the pull-down menu is listed inside of an option tag. The value that gets submitted with the form is the value attribute, and the text that appears to the user is right inside there as the option value. Now, I'm not going to make you type all that. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, you're going to find a little present that I've left for you. Look at that. So what I've got is commented out down here. I've got all those options for every single state. So what I'd like you to do is just go ahead and grab, we've already done Alabama, so we don't need to do that. I'm going to start right here with this option, scroll all the way down, and select Wyoming. Now, make sure you're getting both the opening and the closing option tags, and you don't need these comments, so don't copy those, okay? I'm just going to go up, copy that, scroll up to my form, and right after Alabama, I'm going to create a blank line in my code, and I'm going to paste it. See how easy that was? It sure beats typing, doesn't it? Now, you may have noticed something about the placeholder text that I had down below. This value was slightly different than everybody else. Now, why is that? Well, save the file, go back to Design View, and let's figure that out. If you click any list menu item, you can go down to the Properties Inspector and tell it which one to have initially selected. In this case, we're going to select Alabama because it's the first state alphabetically. But we could have also placed something in our list menu item such as, please choose a state, and had that be the first item. It's really up to you as to how you want to do that, but we have the ability to go ahead and make one of those values initially selected. Now, the hard part about creating list menu items is knowing what to use for the labels and what to use for the data. Unless you're also creating the processing page, you'll need to know the exact names of each of those data fields. And remember, here we're using just that abbreviation. This isn't any different from any other form element. It's just that with list menu items, you have multiple names to worry about instead of just one. Although you can insert radio buttons individually, the most efficient way to place radio buttons in your forms is by using Dreamweaver's radio groups. Radio buttons, by their very nature, are grouped together and only allow for one choice. By using radio groups, you skip the process of having to group the radio buttons together yourself, as well as the pain of having to add them one at a time. So here I have the join.html file open from the 1209 Explorers directory. And I'm going to scroll down through my form and find the very last checkbox, which would be Taste of California. I'm going to hit return to create a paragraph just above that. And there I'm going to type in how many Explore California tours have you been on? All right, and I'm going to hit return to go down the next line, and that is where we're going to insert our radio group. So again, instead of a label, that paragraph is going to act more as a subheading. All right, I'm going to go up to my insert panel and look at my form objects. And I have two choices for radio buttons. I can insert a single radio button, or I can insert a radio group, and that is what we're going to do. So you're going to go up and select the radio grouping icon, which is right beside the single radio button one. And when you do that, you get a brand new dialog box that comes up. Now, you'll notice that we did not see the accessibility dialog box. That's one of the trade-offs for doing a radio group. We're going to have to go back in and manually add things like tab index. That's not that difficult, and I'm actually going to show you a technique that's going to allow you to do that without having to go into code view. Okay, so we need to name this radio group, and I'm going to name it Tours. So when the form is submitted, whatever choice somebody makes from this group, the form data will say Tours equals whatever somebody has chosen. So that's why we're going ahead and giving this a name. All right, our first label is going to be none, and the value for that is going to be 0. So the label is what someone is going to see out beside the radio group. The value is what's going to be submitted with the form. In the case of our form, our values, we're just making them up. But if somebody is creating the form processing for you, you may want to make sure that whatever value you're adding there is sufficient for what they're doing, or they may even have a set of values for you. All right, on the next line, I'm going to go ahead and type in 1 through 3. The value for that is going to be few. Now, to add more radio buttons, all I have to do is click the plus symbol up here. And the next radio button is going to be 4 through 6. We are going to categorize those guys as strong customers, so the value for that is going to be strong. And then finally, one more, and you may have to scroll to see it after you've added it. But that one is going to be 7 with a plus symbol beside it for the label. And then the value for that is going to be heavy, so they would be a heavy user of the Explore California tours. Now, when you place these on the page, Dreamweaver wants to know, should I go ahead and arrange them within a table, which is sort of the older way of doing it, or should I just go ahead and use line breaks? Now, we're not actually going to use the structure that Dreamweaver is going to give us at all. And the easiest structure to get rid of would be line breaks. So we're going to go ahead and click OK and just place our radio buttons right out there on the page. So there you can see we have none, 1 through 3, 4 through 6, and 7 through 8. And I really should have been consistent there. So you're free to go in and change those labels and type in whatever you'd like at any point in time. Now, I mentioned before that we need to do the tab indexing ourselves. I want to show you a very quick and easy way to do that. If I select a radio button, or really any object that I have on my page, and if I want to access the code of that particular object, all I have to do is bring up the Quick Tag Editor. The Quick Tag Editor allows you to edit code from within Design View and can be a huge time saver. To bring up the Quick Tag Editor, you use the hotkey Control or Command T. That's going to bring up our Quick Tag Editor, and you can see we're editing this particular tag. What I'm going to do is add a tab index to this, and I'm going to add a tab index to the first one of 200. I need to do that for each of these. So in order, I'm going to select them, hit Control or Command T to bring up the Quick Tag Editor. And to add an attribute, the easiest way to do this, go to the very last attribute, place your cursor right beside the quotation mark, and hit space. You'll see some code hinting come up. When I hit T, it'll jump down to tab index, and then I can hit return. It'll finish it, add the equals, and place my cursor right inside the quotation marks. I can just type in 210 for the second one, hit return, and I'm done. So please take advantage of code hinting while you're doing this, because it's just going to speed up that process, and it's also going to make sure that the syntax is correct. So I'm going to do that for the next one, and here I want to do a tab index of 220. There we go. And we've got one last one to go, and this one I'm going to give it a tab index of 230. Okay, there we go. So 200, 210, 220, 230. There we go. Now, I mentioned before that we didn't need this structure, so we've got one last task to do, and that is to get rid of the line breaks. The easiest way to do this is through code. So I want to go ahead and just highlight all of those elements and switch to split view so I can see both the code and the design view at the same time. And if you've never seen a line break tag before, this is that tag. It is a self-closing tag. It's just the BR with the /. There's no opening or closing tags. And what you need to do is find the BR tag between each of these radio buttons and just go ahead and get rid of it. Just go ahead and delete it. You don't necessarily have to delete the line like I'm doing. I just like to keep my code nice and organized. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that line break tag between those guys. You should have 3 line breaks, and actually there's a 4th kind of hidden in the last one. So 4 line breaks in there. There you go. Do a save all. And now when I switch back over to Design View, I can see they're all in the same line. So that's what you're looking for. You want all those guys to be on the same line. Perfect. So as you can see, sometimes we have to modify our code. One of the easiest ways to do that is through the Quick Tag Editor. Dreamweaver makes that very simple for us. But there's nothing wrong with occasionally having to go into code view and take care of things yourself. What I do hope that this illustrates for you is that you must make sure that the proper attributes are being used and not take it for granted that Dreamweaver is going to do that for you. Now, we're almost finished with our form. Next up, we're going to give users the option of submitting a comment by using a text area form element. Often, you'll want to give your users plenty of room to say what they need to say. Maybe it's for a comment section, a contact form, or a review that they're filling out. Regardless, if you need to give your user the ability to type in multi-line text of any length, you're going to use the text area field. So I have the join.html file open from the 1210 Explorers directory. I'm going to scroll down to our last radio button, hit return to create a new line just below that. And here, instead of typing something in, we're going to go back to using labels to identify the form element. With our checkboxes and our radio buttons, since those are individuals with their own labels, in order to identify the entire group's purpose, we had to use those singular paragraphs. But now we're back to just letting our label tag do that for us. So I'm going to go up to my form objects, and text area is one of those 3 options in the section just to the right of the form tag. So there's hidden fields, text fields, and there's text area. So go ahead and click to place a text area field on the page. Now, the ID for this one is going to be profile, and the label for this one is going to be profile bio, and in parentheses, type in tell us a little about yourself. So labels don't have to be restricted to 1 or 2 words. You can really make them say whatever they need to say in order to be descriptive for their particular form element. Now, we're going to attach that label tag using the for attribute. and the tab index is going to be 240. So we should be good there. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And there is our text input field. Now again, the layout of this form is pretty weak right now. The default layout of it is not really great. Any screen reader or any other type of user agent that won't be able to read our CSS, however, is going to be able to access these form elements just fine. And visually, we're going to be controlling them through CSS in just a little bit, so I'm not too concerned about the way it looks, at least not yet. Now I'm going to go ahead and select the text area field because here we have a few options that we can go ahead and set manually. First off, I want to make sure that the ID is profile, and it is. Now here we have a character width and a number of lines. Now character width can be set through HTML properties, but it can also be overridden by CSS. Number of lines is going to be the number of multiple lines that somebody can type and be visible at one time, but that can also be overridden through CSS by using of the width property. So I'm just going to leave mine at the default, which in this case is 45 and 5, but if you wanted to set that to an explicit value and not intend to overwrite that with CSS later, that would be fine. Notice that from the type property, this text field is set to be a multi-line. So in reality, you could set a normal input text field on the page, set it to multi-line, and sort of change it into this text area. You can also give it an initial value. So if you wanted to type something maybe a little bit more descriptive into the text field, so there was some default text already in there, you could go ahead and do this. Now, typically, that's only really done if you've got a form that somebody is filling out to, say, update a blog post or something, and you kind of needed some text already in there to sort of jumpstart them. You're really not going to do that as a way of describing what they should type into the form element because that's what the label is for. Plus, it gives your user the added work of highlighting that default text and then having to delete it, and we don't really want to have to do that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and save our file. And we're almost done with our form. However, I want to turn your attention just briefly to the label and its relationship to the text area field. Choosing where to place the label on text areas, that's usually a matter of personal style and personal choice. There are a couple of things that you need to take into consideration. Readability. Can users read it, and visually does it have a relationship to the text area itself? Usability, and how your previous text fields address their labels as well. So how you treat your text fields further up within your form matters here as well. Because of their width, most people expect the label to be above the text area. To avoid too much spacing, you could use a line break to separate the label and the text area, or, as we will use in our form a little bit later on, you can use CSS to control label and form element spacing. Our form is, for the most part, finished and almost ready to go. Currently, however, it has nowhere to go anywhere. A well-structured and designed form is useless without a submit button. Submit buttons are specialized form elements that tell the form to take the data that it's collected and send it to the processing page. To finish the initial construction of our form, we're going to insert a submit button. So again, I have the join.html file open, this time from the 1211 Explorers directory, and scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, and you'll find the last form element we placed on the page, which is the text area. I'm going to place my cursor directly after that and hit return to create a brand new paragraph. Okay, I am going to go up to my insert panel, and almost dead in the middle of the insert panel is a button. Notice it is not labeled as a submit button, it's just labeled as a button. Kind of looks like a chiclet, you know, one of those little pieces of gum? Kind of looks like that. Go ahead and click on that to insert it. And again, our input tag accessibility attributes come up. Well, for ID, I'm going to type in submit. But for this, I don't want any label tag. And look at that. Dreamweaver, it's almost like it can read my mind. Why did it know to do that? Well, submit buttons don't need a label beside them. You're going to have some text on the button that instructs the user as to what's going to happen when the button gets pressed. So you don't really need a label on it. We are going to give it a tab index, however, and this time we're going to give it a tab index of 260. So we're going to go ahead and click OK, and there's our submit button. That was so easy. Now select it, and we'll take a look at some of the properties that we can change. First, the button name, that's the ID that we gave it, and we're going to leave that. But for the value, I'm going to type in join the Explorers. So this can say anything you want it to say. So make it so, submit, click here, click me, send an email, whatever you want it to say. You know, it's a good idea to make it a little descriptive, though. And if you want to put a little oomph into it so people get excited about clicking it, well, there's nothing wrong with that either. Now, you will notice out beside that we have 3 radio buttons that tell this button what it should do. It's submit form, reset form, and none. Submit form does exactly what you think it does. It collects all of the form data that's been filled in that form up to that point, and sends it to either the processing script or the processing page, wherever it's supposed to send that information. Reset the form is basically going to take all of the form elements that have already been filled out, and it's going to clear them out. You may have seen some forms in the past that have the ability to reset the form. I'm not very high on that, because if somebody hits them by mistake, the chances of them going back up and filling out all that information again is pretty remote. So I really don't like the whole clear form thing. Personal choice, though. And then finally, we have none. Now, the none option, that may seem kind of strange, but what that does is it simply strips out any default actions on this particular button. That's going to allow you to go in and, through the use of JavaScript or some of the behaviors that Dreamweaver has, assign a different action to that button, such as navigation or something along those lines. So there you go. Our form is almost finished. There are just a few more things to do. We need to give the user the ability to pick a username and a password for the site. And obviously, we need to address the styling of our form, because it is still not a good-looking thing. Although it's functional, it's not even close to being good-looking. But to make it fit the design of our site a little bit better, and to help with the visual usability, which is just as important as the structural usability, we'll use cascading style sheets to restyle our form and form elements, and we'll do that next. Now that our form structure is nearly complete, we can concentrate on making it fit the visual design of our site. We'll do this by writing styles that target individual form elements and by taking advantage of the additional structure we added to our form with the field set and legend tags. So here I have the join.html file from the 1212 Explorers directory open, and we're going to start adding some styles. Now, prior to this chapter, we've primarily worked with our CSS through either the CSS Styles panel or the New Rule Definition dialog box. Well, this chapter we're going to do something a little different. We're going to go in and we're going to start hand coding our styles. Now, I know for a few of you that may have quickened your pulse a little bit. You may be a little nervous about that, but trust me about something. Hand coding is one of the best ways to quickly gain a comfort level with a certain technology, CSS especially. It's going to help you learn the syntax of it. It's going to help you feel comfortable going in and making those tweaks and edits on your own. And it's also going to help you understand the overall structure of your CSS code and how it relates with everything else. There's really no substitute for getting in there and sort of working with that code and learning it yourself. If you're brand new to Dreamweaver, if you're brand new to hand coding, don't panic. Dreamweaver gives us a lot of really cool tools that's going to help us make sure that our syntax is correct. Plus, we're going to go slowly through all the lines of code, talk about what they're doing for us and why we're writing a specific line. So hopefully you'll find this process just as instructive as working with the CSS Styles panel as well. So what I'm going to do in order to sort of prepare for this, I'm going to collapse my panels down to icons, and then I'm going to switch to a split screen view so that I can see my CSS on the one side and my design on the other. Now I'm going to scroll down so that I can see my form, so I can kind of watch and see what's going to happen with that. And over in the code pane, if you don't see what I see, go up right up here to the document that you have open, join, find the related files, which is listed just below that, and click on main.css. That'll make sure that it's focusing on this code. Now, one of the reasons why I'm hand coding is because our CSS has sort of an empty block where our form styles need to go. So I want to make sure that those go in the right place, and I want to be able to inspect these styles maybe a little bit more closely than some of the other styles we've written. So I'm going to scroll through my code and go all the way down to line 654. Now, that's a lot, but that's fairly standard for a lot of sites out there. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of sites out there that have 3 times this amount of code. All right, so at about line 653, you can see that we have a couple of comments. These little gray lines of code here, /* and ended by a * is a comment. They're not processed by browsers. They're just ways of us sort of talking to ourselves, or in this case, organizing our code. So our form styles are going to go right below the line 653, and then we have individual form areas for code. On another page, we have a support form and a contact form, and here's the area where our join form styles are going to go. Later on, after you're done with this chapter, go to the Clean Site folder within our exercise files, open that up, and check out those other forms and why they needed some individual styling as well. Okay, well, let's start with our overall form styling. I'm just going to type in the selector on line 654. I'm going to type in pound, main content, that's all one word, lowercase m, uppercase c, space form. So we're targeting any form element inside of the main content region. Open a curly brace. You will find those just to the right of the P key. You have to hold the shift key down to get them, and then hit return to go down to the next line. you can see automatically Dreamweaver is bringing up a list of properties that we can choose to set. Type in an F and an O, and it'll jump down in that list to font, and that's what you want. So type in an F and an O, then you should be able to hit return, and Dreamweaver will finish that for you, and you'll see a colon. So for our font, I want you to type in normal, then a space, 0.9 ems. So normal meaning we don't want it italicized, we don't want it bold, and then another space, and then type in an A, and you'll see Arial Helvetica Sans Serif. Go ahead and select that. Type in a semicolon to end that property. Go down to the next line, and here you want to type in color, and the color is going to be pound 193742. So 193742. Type in another semicolon, hit return, and close your curly brace. So you want an opening and a closing curly brace to surround those properties. Now, to learn a little bit more about the syntax of what we're writing here, be sure to go up and watch the chapters on typography and on layout that deal with CSS, as well as any of the other CSS-based titles in the lynda.com online training library. Okay, if I click inside my form now, I can see that the text changes to Arial, and it changes to that sort of darker blue color, so we are well on our way. Now, let's take advantage of the fact that these forms have separate areas defined by field set tags. So I'm going to go up to my form styling in my CSS, and just below the rule that we just created, make sure that you don't get rid of and that you're outside of that last closing curly brace there, and type in pound main content space field set. So field set is one word. Open up your curly brace, and on the line below that, we're going to set some padding. So type in PA, padding will come up. You can hit return, and it'll finish it. And you want to do 40 pixels space 20 pixels space 0 space 0. So that's going to give us 40 pixels worth of padding at the top of a field set. It's going to give us room for our legend tag to show up. We have 20 pixels worth of space to the right of our field set, 0 on the bottom and 0 on the left. So it's just giving a little bit of padding on the top and on the right. Hit return to go down to the next line. And here you want to set your margin. And our margin is going to be set to 0, 0, 2 em. So the zeros here, again, top margin of 0, right and left margin of 0, bottom margin of 2em. So essentially it's just going to push these field sets away from each other so that there's a little bit of space in between them. We're going to do a background color, and the background color here is going to be pound E1 D8 B9. On the next line, we're going to do a border. Our border is going to be none, and that's going to take away any default border because every browser displays the field set as having sort of a gray border around it. We don't want that. Then we're going to do a position property of relative. That's so that we can position items within the field set using absolute or relative positioning. And then finally, we're going to do a float, and we're going to float this to the left. Now, the float really isn't for our forms. It's for the other forms, but we're leaving it in there just so it'll work for us site-wide. We don't really need that for our particular form. In fact, you can see it's causing some real issues with our form as these field sets are sort of stacking right beside each other. So we've got to fix that in just a moment. All right, let's keep going. One of the most difficult HTML elements to style, if not the most difficult, is the legend tag. The legend tag just kind of does its own thing, and different browsers allow different properties to actually affect it. So what we're going to do is come up with some default styling for our legend tag, and then maybe go in and tweak that a little bit to see if we can't place it a little bit more precisely. I'm going to go down to the next line, and I'm going to type in pound main content space field set space legend. So that's the legend tag directly inside the field set. We're going to give it a padding of 0. Don't forget my semicolon there. A margin of 0. And then I'm going to assign it a color, something a little different than the rest of the form. Pound 51341A. So 51341A, it's sort of a brown color. Don't forget to close your rule out. And now if you click back over in your form, you can see that the legends have changed color. They're more of a brown color now. Now, one of the things that's really difficult about styling legends within field sets is positioning them. They want to show up in the upper left-hand corner, and every browser has their own way of positioning them. You would think that just sort of zeroing everything out and then telling the legend where you want it to go would work. Unfortunately, browsers, and in this case most notably Firefox, don't allow certain types of positioning to occur to legend tags. So sometimes you got to be a little tricky. What I'd like you to do is go over to Design View and highlight each of the legends. Personal information is first. Make sure you look at your Properties Inspector and you're on the HTML tab and click the bold icon. That is going to basically throw a strong tag around each one of these legends. I'm going to do the same thing for login information, And I may have to scroll down, but I'm going to do the same thing for tour profile. So each one of these should now look bold, and that's good because we kind of want it like that. But more importantly, it means they have a strong tag around it, and we can now actually go ahead and style that. So what I'm going to do is focus back on our code view, go down to the next line, and here I'm going to type in pound main content space field set space legend space strong. And to be honest with you, we don't really need the field set there. You could have just said main content legend strong, but it helps us understand kind of how it relates to the selector above it. I'm going to go down to the next line, and I'm going to position this using absolute positioning. Now, if you want to know more about absolute positioning, watch the chapter on CSS layout where we talk about it in a little bit more detail. Then we're going to do a margin left of 20 pixels. We're going to do a margin top, and you can just scroll through those lists if you'd like, of 10 pixels. And then finally, a font size, so font dash size, not just font, but font dash size of 1.2 ems. Go ahead and close your curly brace there. Now, when you click, it's not really going to look that good in design view. So when we're done, we're going to preview this in our browser to see where it positions the legend. Now, you might be wondering, well, when we use positioning, we use offsets, so left and top. Why margin left and margin top? Well, again, it's getting around some of these browser bugs and browser errors out there. Instead of using offsets, we're going to use margins to position it, but the absolute position around the strong tag allows us to move it at all. So it's one of those things where it's not an ideal selector, and at first glance, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it does work. Okay, we have one last thing left to do here in this stage of formatting. I'm going to go down into our individual forms, and since each of our forms is different in width and where it's found and how it reacts, a lot of times what you're going to want to do is for a specific form say, okay, for this form, I want all my elements in it to look like this, or I want its width to be this. And that's why we have a separate section down here for our join form, and that's the one we're currently working on. So here, I want you to type in a selector that says pound main content space form, and no space here, pound FRM join. Now, a word about this. This is what we call an element-specific ID selector. It's saying when you find the ID FRM join on a form inside of main content. So that's what it's basically saying. And remember, we named that form FRM join. All right, another space, and then type in field set. So we're targeting the field sets that are only found in our join form. Go down to the next line and type in width 580 pixels. So we're setting an explicit width for our field sets to 580 pixels. When we do that, the form behaves itself a little bit better. So go ahead and do a save all, preview that in a browser, and you can kind of see what we've done to our form. Our field sets are now individual regions. They are separated using the margin. The legend is positioning itself inside the field set instead of right on the edge, and we've given ourselves a little bit of spacing between that. You'll notice that this initial styling helps the overall structure of the form, but it does absolutely nothing for the individual form elements, and that's what we're going to have to tackle next. In our last movie, we targeted some of the basic structural formatting of our form as we styled our form tag, our field sets, our legends, but we largely didn't style any of the interior form elements themselves. So in this movie, we'll return to our styles and begin targeting specific form elements and styling them so that their labels and the form elements themselves fit visually in with the design of our page and with the desired visual flow to assist in usability. So I've got the join.htm from the 1213 Explorers folder opened, and you may have already noticed I have my split view turned on, form on the right-hand side in design view, and the CSS code on the left-hand side. So again, I can go right up to my related files, click on main.css, and this time I'm scrolling down to about line 653, somewhere around in there. This is where all of our forms are. Okay, so now what we need to do now is we're going to concentrate on aligning our labels and our form elements together. One of the things that has always kind of amazed me is how many forms continue to be laid out using tables. A lot of designers really don't want to tackle writing the CSS for laying out the form because it can be a little tricky, and so instead turn to a table structure. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Plenty of designers do that, but it's not as accessible as using CSS because any user agent, including screen readers, still have to parse through the table. And if you don't use the label tags correctly, a lot of the information can sort of get thrown away. So what we are about to do is to write some styles that are going to help our label and form elements line up and form an attractive layout without using tables. Okay, so I'm going to go up to my form styles, and I'm going at about line 676. I'm going to hit return, and first we're going to tackle the paragraphs that are kind of the parent elements of the labels and the form elements themselves. Remember, we surrounded each form element in a paragraph. I'm going to type in pound main content, space form, space P, and then on a line underneath that, I'm going to type in color, and we're going to do pound 193742. Now that's the same color we placed on the form tag, so we don't really need it there. We're just sort of covering our bases in case some other nested style might try to overwrite that. And then underneath that, we're going to do a margin. So we're going to do margin, and we're going to do a top margin of 0, and then a space, right margin of 0, and then a space, bottom margin of 20 pixels, so it's going to keep those elements away from each other by 20 pixels, and then a space, and then a left margin of 20 pixels. So that should hold all of our form elements away from the edge of the field set by 20 pixels. And if I save this and click back on my form, I can see that indeed our spacing looks a little better now than it did before. Okay, now remember, each of these form elements has a label that is associated with them, and remember that the labels are found within the label tag. So now we're going to style our labels and try to create that sort of two-column look between the labels and the actual input text fields themselves. So going back into my CSS, on a line below that, I'm going to type in pound main content, space form, space label. So targeting any of the labels in any form within the main content region. And what we're going to do is we're going to assign a width to those, and we're going to give them a width of 100 pixels. So you can take the label and say, okay, you need to be 100 pixels wide. That means that the shorter ones, the longer ones are all going to be exactly the same width. It's not going to stretch your text out. What it will do is sort of give a singular width for all of your labels, so you won't have those ragged edges that we're seeing right now. Now we're going to float these to the left, so do a float left, and then let's do a clear left, and then we're going to do a margin dash right of 0.75 ems, and then we'll close that rule. Now, what in the world is that doing? Well, remember from the chapter on layout, floats cause the objects underneath them to come up and float beside them. In this case, it's going to help the text input fields float beside the labels and not stack one on top of the other. The other thing that the clearing is going to do for us is basically say, don't let anybody float to my left, and that's going to keep these guys from all stacking up on one line. The margin right of 0.75 ems is going to keep the form elements themselves away from the labels by a consistent amount. And when I click back on my form, you can see exactly what's going on here. We're getting a two-column look from our form now. And let me point out, because I know you're probably looking at this and thinking, wait a minute, Dreamweaver, bless its heart, it has a hard time rendering that legend in place. So you just kind of have to get used to seeing it like that, unless you want to click on Live View. And if you turn on Live View and scroll back down to your form, you'll see your form rendered the way it would be rendered within the browser. So again, we're seeing a 100 pixel width for these guys. And the best way to determine how wide you need that to be is take a look at your longest label and think about maybe how wide that is or how much space you really want to kind of play around with that. And then the margin right is sort of pushing our labels away from the form elements and giving us that sort of two-column look from that. Okay, now we still need to do some specific styling. That 100 pixels is probably going to work site-wide, but you'll notice that we have a pretty large amount of space here, and we have some very, very large labels. You can see we have these guys, like from desert to sea and all those guys that are breaking down, profile, bio. They can't fit within that space. So what I'm going to do is go down to my individual forms. After the join form selector, I'm going to hit return, and here I'm going to type in pound main content, space, form, pound FRM join. Once again, that is all one word, space, label. So now we're only targeting labels in this form, not site-wide. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do a width, this time, of 125 pixels. Let me do a save all. And when I click back in, you can see it pushes our form elements away from that a little bit more. And that's really going to help us down here with our checkboxes. You can see they almost all fit within there now. We're almost done, but I also want to address these text boxes themselves. Maybe I want to make them a little bit wider or a little bit shorter and arrange them in the same order as well. So on the very next line in my styles, I'm going to type in pound main content, space, form, pound FRM join. So remember, it's saying any form with an ID of FRM join, and that's why we have no space right here, and then another space. And here we're going to type in input.text. So remember, these form elements are input tags. This .text, if you remember from our chapter on CSS, that's a class. So we're basically saying if you ever find an input text field with the class of text in this specific form, style it like this. So go ahead and open a curly brace, hit return to go down the next line. And what we're going to do here is we're going to give them a width of 200 pixels. Close that. And then just below that, type in pound main content, form, pound FRM join. And if you are tired of typing those, you can always copy and paste the first part of the selector and then type in the rest of it. And then after that, text area. That is all one word. Text area refers to the larger text field that we have down at the bottom that allows comments. And we're going to give it a width of 500 pixels and give it a height of 150 pixels. And that is why we didn't bother to set a character width or a number of lines for that, because we knew we were going to be tweaking that with CSS. Now, since we were targeting input text fields with only this class applied to it, we need to go back and apply that class. So I'm going to turn live view off. I can go back to just design view and select each one of these text fields individually, and using the properties inspector, apply the class text to it. When you do that, you'll notice that that will extend out a little bit. It'll get a little bit wider, and that's going to assist with the usability because it's going to give your users more room to type and more room for them to see what they're doing. That's only going to work with text fields, so that's all you need to do with that. So again, we're going to do a save all, and we're going to preview that in our browser. We're starting to get a nicely styled form. We've got 2 columns of labels followed by the text input fields. We didn't need a table to achieve that styling. And our text area down here is the size that we were wanting it as well. So we've added a great deal of styling to our form, but our form still lacks the overall structure that it needs. Our next task is going to be to finish the layout of our form by creating multiple columns in our form for these checkboxes and to ensure proper label positioning throughout. We need to continue styling our form by completing our form layout and ensuring that our labels are positioned properly. The position of labels and the form elements they represent is in the end a personal choice, but the majority of forms place all labels in front of their form elements, except for radio buttons and checkboxes, which tend to display the labels after the elements. In addition to styling our labels correctly, we also need to bring some order to our checkboxes, and they are a mess right now. As they are now in separate paragraphs, that creates way too much vertical spacing, and it's going to be confusing to any of the users using our form. So using just a little bit of extra markup, we're going to display our checkboxes in 3 columns, and that should help organize our form greatly. So here we have the join.htm from the 12.14 Explorers directory open. Once again, I've collapsed our panels down, and I'm focusing on the CSS on the left side of our split view and the form on the right side. Now, I've taken the liberty of doing a few things to our form, and I want to point out to you guys what I have done. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit and find our checkboxes, and you're going to see they look a little different. I didn't say they look better yet, but they look a little different. These dotted lines that you're seeing here are div tags. I've taken our checkboxes, we have 9 of them, and split them up into 3 groupings of 3. So if you were to look at the source code, and let me go ahead and click on these again, you would see that these checkboxes are now surrounded by div tags, and the div tags have a class of column 1, column 2, and column 3. So there's column 1, and you can see that's it right there. There's column 2, you can see it right there, and there is column 3. So if you're ever wanting to do this yourself, all you have to do is find your checkboxes, highlight them, and then you can use this little tool right here, wrap tag, to wrap them in a div tag and assign them an ID, or in the case of what we've done here, a class. That just saved us a little bit of time not having to do that ourselves. And one more thing, if I scroll down and look at the labels beside our radio buttons, I can see that they have a class, and I can see that by using our tag selector right here. They have a class now applied to them called inline, so we're going to write a selector that's going to take advantage of that in just a moment. So I'm going to go back to the main.css. There we go. Scroll down. Remember, we're on about line 650, somewhere around in there. And we're actually going to go down to the join form, so around the 689 to 700 range. And we're going to start adding our code here. All right, let's tackle our checkboxes first. I mean, that's a big task, so we'll go ahead and get that out of the way. So on about line 700 there, I'm going to type in pound main content, then a space, form, pound, FRM join. So just the same as we've been doing before. Space, now dot col call 1. So remember, the dot indicates that it's a class, and we're looking for call 1. So any element with the class of call 1 found in the FRM join form, found in main content. I'm going to open up our curly brace and hit return to go down to the next line. And here I'm going to float these to the left. That's going to help us give us our 3-column layout. I'm going to give them some padding to the left. So padding dash left of 20 pixels. Margin right, that's going to keep these guys away from each other a little bit. Margin right, 20 pixels. And I'm going to give the first column a width of 160 pixels. And I calculated that by calculating the width of the field set that they were inside of, how wide their labels need to be, and then kind of sort of splitting the difference. So if you're wondering, how did he know how wide to make that, you basically just figure out how wide your field set's going to be, how much width you need for each of your labels, and kind of factor it that way. Now I'm going to go down to the next line and write a selector for both of my remaining columns. So pound main content, space form, pound FRM join, space dot call 2. Now we're going to apply the same rule to the next two. So I'm actually going to do a comma to group these together, highlight the previous rule and copy it because there's no reason to type all that over again, and then simply paste that after the comma. Change call 2 to call 3, and now we have a grouped selector that's targeting the column 2 and the column 3 at the same time. I'm going to open up my curly brace, hit return to go down to the next line. And here I'm going to type in float left, just as we did before. These are also going to have a margin right of 20 pixels. So for right now, they're almost exactly the same. What is different? Well, in the next line, this time, we're going to give them a width of 170 pixels. So they're going to be just slightly larger, about 10 pixels wider. And if I do a save all and click over here in our form now, we can sort of see a 3-column layout coming to fruition. Now, the reason that we're not seeing a really nice 3-column layout, number one, I'm still in design view. And number two, our checkboxes and their labels are still just a little too large. So using our styles, we're going to target the interior contents of these columns and sort of just shrink everything down a little bit. So on the next line in our code right after that, so we're going to type in pound main content, space form, pound FRM join, space div. So we're targeting div tags that are inside that form. And to be honest with you, those are the only 3 div tags inside of that. So we know exactly who we are targeting. So here we're going to do a little bit of margin work. I'm going to type in margin 0, 0, space 20 pixels, space 0. So top margin of 0, right of 0, bottom of 20 pixels, and left of 0. So what that's going to do is it's just going to push those headings down a little bit there. Right below that, we're going to target our paragraphs as well inside our div tag. So pound main content, space form, pound FRM join, space div, space p. So we're targeting paragraphs inside those div tags now. Once again, open up our curly brace, and here you're going to type in margin, 0 for top, 0 for right, 0.5 ems for bottom, and then 0 for left. And don't forget to close your curly brace there. So now those individual paragraphs, which remember, the label and the checkboxes are fitting in a paragraph, that's going to help us space those guys a little bit closer and tighter together. Now, finally, as far as our checkboxes go, let's go ahead and make the labels themselves a little bit smaller so that they fit in within those columns a little bit better. So pound main content, space form, pound FRM join, div, space label. So really, those are almost the same. We're just now targeting labels inside of these div tags as well. And here, we want to change our font dash size, so not just font, but font dash size to 0.9 em. So we're shrinking them down a little bit. We're going to display them, so do a display inline. And then for floating, I'm going to choose none. So that's going to take away sort of the default float that's been happening there. We want them to be on their own lines. And we're going to display the labels inline so that the checkbox displays right beside them. And when we click on that now, that looks a lot better. But if we go to live view and scroll down, you can see that now we have our 3-column layout. Perfect. Now we're almost done. You guys are doing a great job. I appreciate you hand coding. I hope that you're finding it to be a little bit to your liking at least. And we have 3 more rules that we need to write here really quickly. First, we need to make sure that our radio buttons are appearing on a single line. Right now, this is all really confusing, so let's go ahead and tackle that first. Right down below this rule and type in pound main content space form pound frm join space label dot inline. So we're targeting any label that has the class inline applied to it. We're going to turn float to none, so we're going to turn floating off, and we're going to give it a width of auto. An auto width basically says ignore the width that was set earlier and allow the content itself to form the width of it. That's going to help that out a lot, and you'll notice by clicking into this design view, our radio buttons are now on a single line. Very good. Now, the only other thing we have left to do, these headlines, how many explore California, I am interested in the following tours, profile bio, those are all sort of subheadings, and they really need to relate to that content a little bit more. There's too much spacing there. There's no real great relationship between them, and the profile bio is sitting beside the form element, which just looks weird. So we're going to write a couple of selectors that are going to help us here, and then we're going to apply some classes, and the overall styling of our form is going to be finished. So I'm going to type in pound main content space form space p dot subhead, and subhead is going to be lowercase s uppercase h. So that's basically saying any paragraph with a class of subhead applied to it inside of our form. And down below that, we're going to type in margin, 0 for top, 0 for right, 0 for bottom, and 20 pixels for left. And then we're going to type in clear both. That's going to not allow any floating whatsoever. It's going to make sure that that paragraph stays by itself. But more importantly, we're resetting our bottom margin to 0, which means there won't be a huge amount of space between our paragraphs and our form elements. One last thing, we need to do that to our label as well. So I'm going to go down below that. And I'm going to type in pound main content. Now here we're going to do something a little different. Type in now pound main article as well. So pound main content space pound main article. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Form space label dot subhead. Open up your curly brace. Go down the next line. Here we're going to change display to block. We're going to turn float to none. We're going to give it an overall margin of 0 all the way around and give it a width of auto so that the label itself forms the width. All right, so what are we doing here? Well, the reason we're using this main article is because we want this label, which is right here, it's going to be this little guy, to overwrite all the things that came before. In order to do that, we had to make this selector a little bit more specific, which is why main article is in there, because this form is in main article as well as main content. We're changing the display to block. That means it's going to display on its own line. We're turning floating off, and that is going to prevent our form element from floating up beside it like it is now. Margin of 0 means it's going to appear right above it without a whole lot of spacing between it. And then the width of auto says, don't limit yourself to the 125 pixels that we've put on the rest of the labels. You go ahead and be as wide as you want. In order for us to do that, I'm going to turn off live view. I'm going to click inside this text, use the tag selector right down here to select label, and then I'm going to choose subhead. And you can see, now it sits right on top of that form element, and it's giving us the spacing that I want. I need to do the same thing with our paragraphs. So I am interested in the following tours. I'm going to click inside that paragraph, click the P tag just to make sure that I've got that. And again, using the properties inspector, I'm going to give it the class of subhead. And then I'm going to do the same thing with right here, how many Explore California tours have you been on? Grab the paragraph and make it subhead. Now if we do a save all, test that in our browser. And as I scroll down, now this part of our form is aligning itself quite nicely. So our form now has a robust layout, very clear visual styling. Although at this point our basic form is done from that standpoint, there is still a little bit of work left to do on our form. In our next movie, we're going to explore making our forms more effective by adding user feedback and interactivity. In addition to the pseudo selectors that we have used to style our links, CSS contains other pseudo selectors that allow us to respond to user interaction. One of those, the focus pseudo selector, can be used with forms to let users know when they've changed focus from one form to another. We'll add an additional layer of interactivity to our form by using the focus pseudo selector on our text fields. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, you deserve a break after that last exercise. So this one is going to be a snap. We're only going to do one selector, and it's going to have a profound impact on our form. So I have the join.html file open, And all we need to do is I'm going to switch to split view, make sure I'm focusing on my CSS. And again, I'm going to scroll down to about line 700 or so. There we go. As a matter of fact, line 739, that's where we need to be. I'm going to hit return and go right after that one, and I'm going to type in pound main content space input. Now remember, those are our text fields, dot text. And then, without another space, type in colon focus. Now, you may have remembered, styling our links a while back, we did a colon link, a colon hover, a colon active, a colon visited. Well, it's the same thing. The focus pseudo selector means when somebody has clicked on this form element or established focus on it. So by saying input.text colon focus, we're saying when somebody has selected any input field with the class of text. Very nice, right? Well, we also want to do the same thing to our text area. So I'm going to do a comma, pound main content, space, text area, one word, colon focus. So those are both going to do the same thing for us. And that comma right there between them is going to group them together. Open a curly brace, and all we're going to do here is change a background color. So type in background, pound FFC, which is sort of a cream color. Close that, do a save all, and guess what? You're done. Let's go ahead and preview that in our browser. And let's check out what that does for us. By establishing a background color, when somebody has focus in a text field, when you click inside the text field, notice that the background color changes, and you're essentially giving your user that input that they're typing into that specific area. Now, it's important to note that not every browser supports the focus pseudo selector on form elements, most noticeably some of the older versions of Internet Explorer. However, the additional usability that this brings to your forms in standards-compliant browsers is well worth the extra line or two of code within your CSS. Besides, non-standards-compliant browsers will still display your form just fine. Its users just won't have this really cool increased interactivity that we're seeing here. Occasionally, you will create forms that have information that the user is required to fill out. Our registration form, for example, will require a username and password to be submitted before the user can register for our site. How we inform the user of this requirement is up to us, but it is fundamental to good form design. One option is to simply write the requirement next to the form element. A more thorough option is to add some type of form validation to your form. Form validation comes in two flavors, server-side and client-side. Server-side validation requires server-side code and is a little outside the scope of this class. Client-side validation uses JavaScript to check the form when it is submitted or if the form element changes to see if everything that is required is filled out properly. If not, the user is then given feedback and an opportunity to correct the form. Dreamweaver has long had client-side validation available in the form of a behavior. The validate form behavior would trigger a simple warning dialog box to inform the user of the error. Although effective, it definitely left something to be desired in the way of presentation. Well, starting with Dreamweaver CS4, Adobe added Spry validation widgets to its capabilities. These widgets allow robust client-side validation that is easy to control and style even if you don't know anything about JavaScript. So if you've been wondering about that hole in our form, we're about to fill it. So I've got the join.html file open from the 12.16 directory, and this middle login area is totally empty. We need to fix that. So go ahead and place your cursor inside that field set and hit return. Now, don't freak out if login information shows down here. Remember, Dreamweaver's just having a hard time display that. That's okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go up to our form objects, and these little green icons on the right-hand side, those are your Spry validation widgets. The first one we're going to use is a Spry validation text field. I'm going to go ahead and click to add that, and you're going to see the input tag accessibility attributes come up just as you would with any other form element. And that's one of the most popular misconceptions that I want to go ahead and get rid of right here. Some people are under the mistaken impression that a Spry validation form widget is unlike your other form elements. It's not. It is a form element. The only thing that's different is there's a little bit of code wrapped around it that helps the JavaScript know what to do with that specific form element. Okay. So for this ID, we're going to type in user_name. The label is going to be username. So that'll be the username they're able to choose. And the only other thing we're going to change is tab index is going to be 70. I'm going to click OK and place that on the page. Now, just like any other form element, you can style them. So I'm going to go ahead and click the text box to select it. So I'm going to focus right there on that text input. And I'm going to change the class to text. There you go. So that it has the same width and the same layout arrangement as our other text fields. So when you first start out, you won't really see any difference. Now, how do these things differ? Well, you'll see they have a blue outline around them, and we have a blue tab in the upper left-hand corner. Go ahead and click that blue tab. Your Properties Inspector is now going to reflect the properties of your Spry Validation widget. For type, I'm just going to grab the pull-down menu and take a look at these options, but for what we're doing here for the username, we're going to allow anything to be typed in. If you needed to filter this, for example, if it needed to be a phone number or an email address or a zip code, you can go ahead and do that, and the Spry Validation widget will basically look for that type of an object typed into it. We're actually not going to put any constraints on this. We just want it to be required. Now, your form validation field is going to have several preview states based upon the options that you choose. The initial value is going to look like any other text field. However, notice what happens if somebody doesn't fill it out. They're going to get this message. So if you grab the preview state and go down to required, they're going to get this message right here, a value is required. Well, you're free to customize that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the word required in there. I'm going to remove a value is, and I'm going to put brackets on either side of the word required, just like that. So now when it reads required, it'll have those little brackets around it, and it's just a little bit more of a subtle message, if you will. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, sometimes those can be hard to change. For some reason, when you highlight them sometimes, it deletes the entire text field. It can be a little tricky. So just to show you how this is set up within your code, if I switch to a split screen view with this in code, you can see that this text is just sitting right here inside the span tag. So if you wanted to, you could go in code and you could type in anything you wanted to within that span tag, and it would work out just fine. Okay, the next thing I need to set is when I want this to validate. Validation basically is asking you, when should I check? By default, when the form's submitted, the JavaScript is going to check the form element. But you can also say, hey, whenever somebody types in it, and if somebody loses focus. So if they were to click into it and then click off of it, it would validate at that point as well. Okay, cool. I'm going to take it back to its initial state. Then I'm going to place my cursor right out beside the existing form validation and hit return to go down to the next line. Now next we need a password. So I'm going to go up to my validation widgets, and I'm going to find the Spry validation password. It is the third item from the right there. I'm going to click on that. And once again, we're going to give this an ID, and this one is going to be PWD, and label is going to be password, and the tab index for this one is going to be 80. Well, now that we've sort of seen how this works, they can be pretty quick to set up. I'm just going to click the text field, use the Properties Inspector to give it the text class so that it gets the same width, and then click the blue tab so that I can set my individual properties for this Spry widget. Now here we are going to have some requirements. Each password has to be at least 6 characters long, so I'm going to type in a minimum characters of 6. You can see that triggers the message minimum number of characters not met. I'm going to go through my messages in order. I'm going to grab the preview states and hit required. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to highlight that, type in a bracket on the either side of that. Click on the tab again. This time I'm going to choose minimum number of characters not met. I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to change that to must be at least 6 characters. So you can get as descriptive with this as you want. Again, I'm going to put those brackets in there. That's just my kind of way of visually formatting this to be a little bit different. You don't have to use those. I'm just using them from a purely decorative standpoint. Now next, I'm going to preview the valid state. It just happens to be a nice green checkbox, but of course you can change that as well if you want to. Okay, so everything's looking good there. And finally, I'm going to validate that on blur and change as well, and then save the file. Now, as soon as I save this file, I want to point out to you what's going to happen here. All these Spry assets, Spry validation password CSS, the JavaScript, everything required for these form validation widgets is going to be copied to my site. If I don't already have a Spry assets folder, it's going to create one for me in the root directory, and it's going to copy the files there. Now, as long as I maintain the relationship between this file and those files, we're going to be fine. If I upload this site to my remote site, as long as I make sure that those folders stay in the same relation, I'm going to be okay. If I start moving those around without telling Dreamweaver to update the links, it could cause some issues. So as we get towards the close of this particular movie, I'm going to show you how to control where those go with a little bit greater detail. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and I can actually see there's my Spry Assets folder right there. Now, Dreamweaver may come up and tell you that there is a syntax error. That is typically incorrect. It's just kind of a little bug that I don't think they've worked out quite yet. So if you see that in your version, don't worry about it. Everything's okay. I'm going to click right out beside my Spry Validation widget, hit return to go down to the next line. And the last validation widget we're going to put on there is a Spry Validation Confirm. If somebody's going to type in a password, they can't see what they're typing in. So you want to make sure that they didn't make a misspelling or something that's going to cause them not to be able to log into your site. So I'm going to click right here on the Spry Validation Confirm widget. The ID for this one is going to be Confirm. The label for this one is going to be Confirm Password. And the tab index for that is going to be 90. Once again, we're going to do some very similar things here. I'm going to click on the text field, and using the pull-down menu from my Properties Inspector, I'm going to assign the text class to it. Then clicking on the blue tab for the Spry Confirm widget, I'm going to make sure it's validating against the password. It picks up on that automatically, but you might want to just verify that and make sure that it is. For my preview states, I'm going to go down to Required. Again, I'm just going to do the same thing I've been doing. I'm going to surround that in brackets and get rid of any of the other punctuation. And then finally, go down to the invalid. And instead of saying the values don't match, I'm just going to type in bracket mismatch, comma, please try again. I always like being polite, at least most of the time. There we go. And I'm going to validate that on blur and on change as well. Now I'm going to do a save all. And you'll notice it's going to add even more. So each one of these Spry widgets have their own set of files that it's going to copy over. So you could wait till you've added all these and just add them all at once, or you could do it like we've done it here, which is to do it incrementally. Now, one last thing, guys. We're almost ready to test this, but you'll notice that the default styling for this, sort of a red text with a red box around it, doesn't really match our site. Well, that's okay. The CSS is being driven by these external pages up here, but that's not to say that we can't change them. So here's what we're going to do. I want you to take each one of these and click on the tab for the validation widget and choose one of the required states. It doesn't matter which one, just choose one of the required states. There we go. We're going to go ahead and style these guys all individually by using the Code Navigator, and it's the easiest way to find the targeted selectors that we need. So I'm going to hold down my Alt key and click on this text. On the Mac, you'd want to hold down the Command option. And we're looking not in our CSS, we're looking in Dreamweaver CSS. If you thought our CSS was complicated, look at that. We're going to find these really long group selectors, and you want to click on that. And as soon as you do, it'll jump you into Code View, and these guys are just kind of stacked one on top of each other. We're just going to change the color. I'm going to change it from the CCC to 51341A. That's that brown color. And then for border, I'm just going to change that to none. I've got my brackets, really don't need that border. I'm going to scroll through this code and see if that appears anywhere else, that display inline, color, and border. It doesn't. So we're good in this one. All right, we'll do a save all. I'm going to do the exact same thing again. I'm going to go right over here. I'm going to hold down my Alt key and click. That would be Command Option on the Mac. Find which of those guys has the display, color, and border properties and click. It'll jump me right to that spot. And all I've got to do is type in that color value. Again, if I was smart, I would have copied it, 51341A, and border of none. There we go. I'll again look through this to make sure that we didn't miss anybody. I think we're okay. We'll do a save all, and we're going to finish it up by going right here and doing it again. So trigger your Code Navigator, find the one with the display, color, and border properties, and just switch those out. So the brown color for that red color, it's 51341A, and a border of none. So, you know, when you're working with any of these Spry objects, the validation widgets included, don't be nervous about going in and changing their CSS. That's why they made these, so that you could go in there and style them the way you wanted them to look. So just because there's a default look to something doesn't mean that you have to be tied to that. So again, go ahead and do a save all, and then let's preview that in our browser and see how that works. So if I go down to this area of the form, if I click in username and just hit tab to ignore it, you'll notice that my browser is now telling me this is required. As soon as I type in a password, it tells me it has to be at least 6 characters, so I can do that. And then if these values don't match, it's going to let me know they don't match, and I just get to keep trying it. So cool. Also notice that the focus on these is exactly the same color, that sort of cream color. So we've got a lot of consistent styling throughout a form, which is exactly what we want. Now, by using Spry validation widgets in your form, you can add rich client-side form validation that guides users through filling out your form. It's worth noting that the JavaScript and CSS used to drive the validation widgets is fully customizable, so changing how the validation notifications are formatted is as easy as changing out the CSS.